Welcome, all you adventurous readers, to the epic worlds of Alfred Döblin, where we explore the life and works of this fascinating but little-known early 20th century writer, brought to you by the website beyondalexanderplatz.com.
So welcome to episode 10, which we're calling Things Fall Apart. I'm Chris Godwin, I'm here with...
Katie Kavanagh. Hello, everyone. Yes, things fall apart, Chris. So we should probably do a quick recap. In our previous episode, we covered Döblin's greatest publishing success, which was Berlin Alexanderplatz. So whatever has happened, things fall apart. Why have we named this Things Fall Apart?
Well, because things really were falling apart, both in Döblin's personal life and family life and in the wider world. Berlin Alexanderplatz was published 2 weeks before the Wall Street crash of 1929. And the Wall Street crash reverberated around the world over the next 2 or 3 years, causing, bank failures and enormous unemployment and, inability of businesses to get loans and so on. It had a huge impact in Germany. And in fact, there was a family impact for the Döblins, should we mention that now?
Yes, let's go ahead.
His elder brother, Ludwig. Ludwig had been a mainstay of the family for decades. He'd become an apprentice to his uncle's timber business when they first arrived in Berlin in the 1880s.
Chris, is Ludwig Döblin's eldest brother? Okay.
His oldest brother.
So like the head of the family.
But he'd been supporting actually both his parents, his mother, who was still there in Berlin, and his absconded father, who was eking out an existence in Hamburg. He was providing little subventions to...
And what led to his suicide?
Well, one result of the Wall Street crash was that the timber business went belly up.
Okay.
And at the same time, there was a rather interesting little kind of romantic entanglement as well, which had gone sour, where he'd been having an affair with a lady who was actually married to a patient of Döblin's. And when her husband died, she called off the relationship with Ludwig.
Mm-hmm.
So he was, he was in despair because of, the looming bankruptcy of his business, and then also the, I suppose, sort of heartbreak at losing this love affair. And so he blew his brains out in a toilet in a station in Berlin.
Gosh. Oh dear, that's very traumatic.
Yes.
And I guess it reverberated widely within their family.
Well, it certainly didn't help in this atmosphere of, looming disaster that was becoming like an express train sort of rushing down on Germany. In the few years, from sort of 1930 to 1933, basically, Germany hardly had a government. Parliament was useless. No single party could form a government because they were just all squabbling all the time. Then the president of the Reich could take lots of powers and issuing states of emergency, which means that they could suspend any laws they wanted at any time. Street politics were becoming more and more deadly with, street battles between gangs of thugs from the right and the left. By 1931, there were almost 5 million unemployed in Germany, and then 6 million by 1932, lots of bank runs and failures. And this was in just a few years of the previous, huge hyperinflation in Germany, which had basically wiped out the middle class. Now this was a second economic blow on, a Germany that was still sort of putting itself together after the First World War. And, not surprisingly, the Nazis, with their sort of their organizational skills and the vehemence of their political message, were, gaining large amounts of support in the in elections. There were quite a lot of elections in those few years. So they got 18% of the votes in September 1930, and then in July 1932 they became the largest party in the Reichstag with 37% of the votes, but still didn't form a government. Didn't have a majority. So it was backstage dealings before the doddery old warhorse Hindenburg named Hitler as the chancellor in January 1933.
Right. So it's quite tumultuous, scary times. And so, what was Alfred doing during these years?
Um, well, the sudden release from penury. I mean, he'd been complaining of what a poor income writers get in Germany, and his medical income wasn't particularly huge.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Now suddenly he was debt free because Alexanderplatz was such a success. He'd
It's doing so well.
managed to pay back there's something 18,000 marks he owed Sammy Fisher for advances which had so far not been recouped for all these flops that Fisher had been publishing. And now he had all this foreign income coming in from the translation rights from
Mm-hmm.
countries.
And
Uh,
so, this we know that from the success of Berlin Alexanderplatz, Erna was very insistent on moving their family to a smarter location.
Absolutely. And, having this money in the bank, rather removed, one of Alfred's leading kind of objections as to why this was not going to be possible.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yes, they moved to a very select address in the Kurfürstendamm. In fact, there were just a few doors down from Hermann Goering
Oh,
into a big 8-room apartment.
wow, brilliant.
But, this meant that Alfred was giving up his medical practice, which
Mm-hmm.
was, a large part of his um, kind of stimulus in his life for
Mm-hmm.
meeting real people and understanding the problems of living in this big city under a economic system that was, really not doing very much for the lower strata of society.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yes, so they did eventually move. Um,
And you said an 8-room apartment. Wow.
Eight-room apartment, so each
And
of the boys could have their own separate bedroom. My
that
goodness.
sounds amazing.
Yeah. But also, it provided the space where he could set up what they called a Thursday evening salon.
So they could entertain
Yes, but I mean, Alfred was entertaining these weekly salons for
writers, I'm
people to discuss
assuming.
writers and editors and so on to discuss current problems.
Wow.
And these kept going until February 1933, although the numbers were dropping off gradually, during the previous year. But
Right.
this was, in the atmosphere of the earlier Weimar years, this would have been a kind of very hopeful action, which seemed to be leading somewhere. But
Mm-hmm.
now, with the things going on in the world around him and things going on in his life, it was it was a bit of you say, a desperate move to hope by doing something that something good was going to come of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And how was Döblin? Was he sad about losing his practice or his medical practice, or was he?
He was very fed up. Um, in fact, by 1932, he was making practical measures to rent premises back in the old quarter.
Oh, okay.
Um, but when he tried to, he'd already lapsed his medical membership in the official roll of recognized doctors by the insurance companies.
Mm-hmm.
He'd already lapsed, right, because he'd given up his practice. And when he tried to re-register, they said, we're going to have to re-register you as a novice doctor
Oh no.
after 20
Ah,
years of practice.
rubbish.
This is
Yeah,
not what we can do it. Sorry.
I can see that would have been very frustrating.
Yeah. So, he was, and perhaps, I mean, at this point, we should perhaps put the success of Berlin Alexanderplatz in context, because within Germany, although it sold roughly 45 to 50,000 copies by 1933 within
Mm-hmm.
Germany, let's put this beside the copies of Thomas Mann's Buddenbrooks,
Mm-hmm.
which was reprinted after Mann got the Nobel Prize a few
Mm-hmm.
after Alexanderplatz was published.
Mm-hmm.
A huge surge in demand for that book, which led to 700,000 copies.
Oh wow. that eclipses Berlin Alexanderplatz then,
I
doesn't
mean,
it?
50,000 is respectable, but
Yeah.
it's by no means a blockbuster. And I
Ah,
mean, it really was the international attention to Alexanderplatz which caused its big, caused it to eclipse all Döblin's other works.
right. Was Buddenbrook internationally acclaimed, or was it focused within Germany?
Um, I actually need to check when Buddenbrooks was first translated into English. I mean, there is a current translation by the late John E. Woods, who
Hmm.
was a brilliant translator from German. But I haven't really checked up on what translations there were.
Oh my goodness, Chris, have I found a question that stumped you?
Yes, I'm
That's
possibly we can
amazing.
add in a little note to the transcript.
Oh, fantastic. I'm very happy about that. So it took till episode 10 to get.
I mean, yeah, but remember we're going to be doing a season 2, so
Okay, okay.
yeah,
Phew, good.
yeah. There's another thing about Alexanderplatz as well. You might interject. I mean, Döblin mentioned in a letter to a friend that people had said the ending of Alexanderplatz is a little bit unsatisfactory because Bieberkopf ends up as a kind of gatekeeper at a factory somewhere. He's leading a steady life.
Hmm.
People thought this wasn't very factory. And he explained in a letter that he'd been planning a second volume to lead on.
Oh, interesting.
Things would have clarified in that second volume, but he
Yeah.
never got around to it.
Oh, that's really interesting. I wonder what would have happened there.
Yeah.
Okay, so then were you talking about was there something about a radio play or
Yes. Well, if we talk generally about what was Alfred doing during these years, I mean his activity with the Academy of Arts, was continuing. He was still pushing an active agenda. He was talking to the Ministry of Education about modernizing school textbooks,
Mhm.
which, as we've said in previous episodes, were sort of stuck in the mid 19th century,
Yes.
um, and really pushing very hard for closer contact um,
Mhm.
between academicians, critics, scholars, literary scholars, and writers.
Mhm.
But there was a growing schism between the right wing nationalist members of the academy and
Mhm.
some of the others, including Döblin and Heinrich Mann were on the other side. Um, so this led to sort of bitter debates in the academy, and then the right wing members resigned in January 1931. And Döblin was being harassed. He was being accused of leaking confidential materials from confidential, closed sessions of the academy, which trying to deal with these schisms. Um, but
Okay,
yes,
and so how about his writing then?
yeah, he lots of spin-offs from Alexanderplatz.
Mhm.
Um, the Berlin Radio commissioned a radio play. Uh, this was never actually broadcast.
Oh no.
However, one of the rehearsals for the play was recorded on wax discs,
Oh.
and these were found in Germany in the 1960s.
Oh
They
wow,
were
so they
broadcast
survived.
both in East and West Germany.
Wow.
The radio play was broadcast.
Amazing.
And then in July 1932, Döblin was actually banned from appearing on the radio because there was so much right-wing pressure being put onto the senior management of the station.
Mhm. And what was that for?
Well, because Döblin was obviously as a nasty Jewish left-wing agitator.
Okay. Okay. And so they were squashing anything that was controversial
Yes, of course, it's something that
in
can never
their eyes. Okay. All right. And then was there, so going on to 1931, was there
Yeah,
a talking
this
film?
talking film came out. I mean, Döblin was helping with the talking film. In fact, Hugo, his younger brother, opened the first talking film school in Berlin. I'm not
Mhm.
sure how successful that was. Obviously, it couldn't last very long.
Mhm.
Um, but the film was actually a disappointment because for all the the cinematic tricks of the novel, the flashing from scene to scene and the the kind of confusion of montages of stimuli that were coming from every side in the street and so
Mhm.
on. The film just is basically a linear plot about some gang of criminals, which is a shame. Um, and I mean, then Dublin was also very busy uh, agreeing to accepting invitations from reading groups in various German cities to come and talk to them about Alexanderplatz and other things. And he was sometimes on the road for a whole week, going from town to town. Like some, I don't know, a minor pop star or something, doing a tour in little town halls. This,
Yes.
yeah. One has to wonder whether this just wasn't a kind of busy work, because he still had all this energy buzzing away within him. But how was he going to put it into useful directions?
Yes. Okay. And then was he doing, during this busy work period, was he doing any other writing whilst he was on the road or traveling or
Yes, he was. In fact, his writing for the stage started at last to sort of show some signs of promise. That the theatre directors were starting to take an interest.
Mhm.
Um, but when one of his plays was put on in Munich,
Mhm.
the Munich police banned it after 2 weeks on the grounds that it was communist propaganda undermining the family.
Oh, okay.
This was after they had the Munich authorities had a kind of a charity performance of this play, where all the takings went to the charity called the Winterhilfe.
Mhm. Mhm.
But after that, they banned it. So
Oh gosh.
we'll be talking a bit more about that when we come to our reading.
Okay. Okay.
But interestingly, that play, which was called Marriage, or Die Ehe,
Mhm.
um, when it was staged in Leipzig, because Leipzig obviously didn't come under, being in Saxony, didn't come under a ban in Bavaria.
Okay.
Um, so Alfred went along to attend the premiere, along with Erna and with Jola.
Okay. So, and was Yola there in capacity to look after children, or was she there as a family friend?
Well, I mean, the children would have stayed behind. Well, the teenagers by this time, some of them, they would have stayed behind in Berlin. But the fact that Erna and Jola were in the same little group is quite interesting at this
Mhm.
fairly late stage, in
Mhm.
1930.
Okay.
But then after that premiere, Yola had a breakdown when I think she finally realised that Alfred was not going to leave his family.
Okay. Okay.
Very sad. But also, and this play also caused another little kerfuffle, because a report appeared in a newspaper to say that, oh, this play wasn't actually created by Alfred Döblin.
Mhm.
He was just a stenographer for ideas that other people were feeding him. And he reacted quite bitterly to this, but just didn't have the energy to take them to court. So the other thing he was working on, there was a student had written to him for advice on how to navigate through these dangerous political waters that Germany found itself in. So Alfred wrote several uh, articles for the newspapers, a whole series, trying to give his views on how can sensible people get along in this atmosphere.
Mhm.
Um, and these were eventually published as a book, um, but it was really rather a forlorn effort. I mean, he focused on sort of making the economy fairer and making sure that people had free speech, and didn't really address the growing menace from the totalitarian elements in the
Mhm.
political world. And
Okay.
he'd already begun to write his next big epic, The Babylonian Exile, in 1932. He'd had a premonition of exile already a year before he actually had to flee. And when he was giving part of his reading tour, took him to Zurich, um,
Mhm.
in 1932, and he met various colleagues in the psychological profession there, who were quite helpful to him in the early of his exile. But a fairly good sign of Döblin's loss of nerve, if you want to put it, was he did a drastic rewrite of Mountains, Oceans, Giants. He'd already been arguing that the level of German literature should be lowered, because at the moment German literature adopted a very high tone. The audience it aimed at was the elite of those who'd, say, gone through a university education, which are probably 1 or 2% of the population. And we need to lower the level of literature so that people with not university educations can also enjoy and learn from it and enrich their experience from it. And for some reason he thought that he should simplify Mountains, Oceans, Giants. And really, it was a dreadful rewrite. I got a copy of this, which he called Giants, an adventure book, and tried to read it and do it justice. But that voice we had in Mountains, Oceans, Giants, this kind of the urgency and the as somebody called it, it was like a 27th century version of The Economist on steroids.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it turned out he had the
And
voice.
that's lost.
He had the voice of a slightly bored museum creator, sort of pointing out interesting things from the book, but he himself had basically lost interest in it years ago.
Oh,
it was very...
Chris, that's a really interesting way of looking at it. If he did it himself to try and broaden the appeal to a wider audience, and you're saying that he lost his nerve, but then when you translated different works, you edited as well, and you cut large sections out of different works. So how, if the original author decides to cut things and rearrange things, how is that losing their nerve?
Well, I think there's two things there. First of all, I only cut one bit of material from one of his novels.
Okay.
But still made it available on the website for those who wanted to go and look at it. Right? But secondly, those cuts, I think some critics have actually said Döblin's novels would be better if they were half the length. Right? And I think this is fairly true. He did let his alter ego that was guiding his writing run away with itself quite often. But the second thing is the Giants and Adventure book is not just cutting bits out of Mountains, Oceans, Giants. It's a complete recasting.
Okay.
So that because at the end of Mountains, Oceans, Giants, he still hadn't quite decided whether he wanted nature to put human beings in their place or whether he wanted human beings to be the masters of nature.
Right.
And he came to what was no conclusion to this dichotomy at the end of Giants by saying, no, there is a third thing. It is called the law, which is fairly meaningless. As I say, it was the whole tone of the book was very, very different.
I keep forgetting that obviously we're on a podcast. So I'm nodding my head and people can't see. I'm nodding my head. Okay, thank you for that. Okay. So I'm going to move on now. You mentioned earlier the Academy and the Thursday evening salons. What else was Döblin the activist doing?
Okay. Well, he was put onto an advisory committee for the Goethe Prize. This is a fairly large and influential prize. So he was put on the committee and he lobbied very strongly for Sigmund Freud, because he said the whole point of the Goethe Prize should not be to reward people who are studying Goethe and the people around him in the late 18th, early 19th century. It should be recognizing people who had the similar inquiring minds leading to, breakthroughs in human understanding of our present day. And eventually he prevailed. But Sigmund then wrote to them and said, "Well, he's a bit too old and cranky now to make the journey to Frankfurt, so he'll send his daughter along to pick up the prize."
Okay.
Yeah. But Alfred was also engaging at this time fairly seriously with Jewish groups, because there was a lot of interest at this time with the growing menace from the right
Hmm.
in what was called the New Territorialism movement. In other words,
Hmm.
let's find a nice uninhabited empty space somewhere on the earth where we can all go and then set up our kind of free society.
Yeah.
And this is all probably a few hundred years too late.
Hmm.
Um, but he was, I say, he was quite engaged with them, and he did. I mean, one of the volumes in his collected works is a fairly lengthy volume of his writings on the Jewish question, and he was continuing to engage with these people in Paris up till about the mid 1930s.
Hmm. So he had quite a shift in thinking then, because earlier you said, not in this episode but in a previous episode, his family weren't a practicing
Yeah, well, they
Judaism.
left the Jewish community in 1912. Yes,
And he eventually converted to Catholicism.
he did. We'll come to that in season 2.
Hmm. So that's interesting that um, he's advocating.
Well, he's engaging. He's engaging with a a social grouping, because he didn't have a home really anywhere in
Yeah.
the political system in the other
Okay.
parties. And so this was a group engaging where he could engage intellectually with the arguments for and against this
Right.
way of behaving, that way of behaving, and
Got you.
yes.
Okay. And then um, moving on from, so we're in the mid 1930s now, are we?
Well, no. I mean, in this episode, we're really only going up to the very beginning of 1933.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Then we'll be dealing with exile and after in season 2.
Okie dokie. All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, a final thing he was involved with. There was a series of 8 conferences. This is very late in the day, from November 32 to February 1933. There were 8 conferences bringing together writers and philosophers to discuss the living and the dead in Marxism. Right? And Brecht attended, Günther Anders attended, and various other people who became quite famous later on.
Hmm.
But again, this was a fairly forlorn attempt to deal with big questions of political theory, while the world was falling apart around them.
Mm. Oh, it's a bit heavy, this episode, isn't it, Chris?
Well, it is, but we have to we have to engage with it,
Yeah.
because whenever critics say, oh, his his qualities as a writer really fell off after Alexanderplatz,
There were
they're rather ignoring the fact
massive
of his
events that were
life
happening.
after Alexanderplatz,
Yeah.
and the challenges he had to face for the next 12 years and after, um, to survive and keep creating.
Yeah, sure. Okie dokie. Is it time for a reading?
Okay, so we mentioned his play Marriage.
Hmm.
Yeah, and he wrote a nice little piece about the uh, the economics of playwriting. He'd done a bit of whinging earlier on in the mid-20s about how poorly rewarded writers were, and somehow publishers and paper makers and printers and so on all seemed to make a good living out of distributing writings, but the writer tended to come out at the bottom of the heap.
Yes.
And so this reading is called Sheer Delight at the Theatre.
Okay.
So who's going to read this? Shall I read
I
it?
I think you should, if it's his voice. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so this appeared in January 1931 in the Berliner Tageblatt. I wrote my 3rd play about a year and a half ago. I'd better mention first that I've also written a whole library of so-called novels. A consequence of my inclination to write such books is that my rather numerous family has always lived on the bare minimum needed for existence, for my writerly inclination hindered me from spending every hour of the day on my medical profession. In the district where I live, colleagues in the profession, my equals, have in due course achieved a good outcome because they devote themselves intensively to their practice and its expansion, whereas I ambled along at the bare minimum for existence. For in order to write such worthless books, you need not just time for the actual writing, but also for constant periods of contemplation where you sit down somewhere and think of nothing. And these are the most important times for life and production. At one point, a year or two ago, my way of existing and writing worthless and useless books was going quite badly. My publisher withdrew credit, calculating truthfully that I owed him debts, debts, debts. And on top of that, I owed him not one or perhaps two books, but at least a whole year of work. Better pass over in silence the awful year that ensued. I was brought through it only by my unflinching rage and some help from a friend. I'm telling all this because I'm no unique case. With a few exceptions, it befalls everyone who writes, even quite prominent figures. There's no time for thinking and writing, for discovering, conveying to others. Time only for earning. My latest book has helped to put me back on my feet. But for how long? Then I'll fall flat on my face again, because I cannot and never will abandon my habit, my bad habit, of thinking and writing, discovering, conveying to others. I want to tell now how things have gone with my latest theatrical play. So we'd been holding here in Berlin a little discussion circle. It included some writers, and one day a theatrical type came along and asked if we might offer him some material. We continued our discussion in the usual manner, including material for a play and some general themes. Sometimes it was amusing, sometimes lively, sometimes boring. All in all, nothing came of it. But one day I sat down having had a veritable stroke of genius. Characters and a format became clear to me. I mentioned this to our circle, but just a bit. I kept most of it to myself, for I work only for myself. And when I'd written my play in all stealth, I read one act from it to our circle, and was buried in icy silence. I then gave the play to the theatrical type. He said nothing, and in a newspaper I suddenly saw in print that the chap approved the format of my play, but a production didn't suit him, and so he wouldn't take it on. Then a musician who'd wanted to write the music for the play told me to give a reading to another theatrical chap, a good contact, and I did so on a gloomy evening. How stupid and clueless and childish a fellow must be, ever and again stupid and clueless and childish. There they sat, legs stretched out, smoking their cigar or pipe, and I was buried in icy silence. When the play was finally launched in one or two towns, three amusing and less amusing things happened, and I experienced the pleasure of having written a play with all the bells and whistles, having for long years enjoyed the no lesser pleasure of having written so-called, not really, novels. Then one day a provincial newspaper reported that the play, which previously no dog would even sniff at, was not really by me. All I had done was transcribe it from dictation. I won't say whose. What luck! Now I had a complaint for discovery, defamation, damages, and what else. In another town, there were weeks of preparation for a production, and then it launched, and after a short run, it was banned by the police. To conclude, yesterday the postman brought me a letter from my publisher relating to theatrical matters, with a statement of account. This you must see, and then you'll know something of the joy of writing plays. So, the play ran for 8 performances in one town. One performance was a benefit to the state for its Winterhilfe charity, whereupon the state bagged the takings and promptly banned the play. The 7 performances brought in around 10,000 marks. That number stood proudly at the head of the statement. I was already beaming. You should have seen me beam. But then my eyes go down the page. Numbers, numbers. I'll be getting even more, and still more. Wonderful. I turn the page, and there it stands. You owe 123 marks and 5 pfennigs. That's right. I have to pay 123 marks and 5 pfennigs. You ask, how can the theatre take in 10,000 marks and I have to supplement it with 123 marks and 5 pfennigs? Well, it's all very natural, totally natural. From the start, I, as an author, would receive only 10% of the 10,000 marks. That amounts to 1,000 marks. 3% goes at once to central accounts. Okay, that's not too painful. Then a whole string of leisurely deductions from my not even 1,000 marks. 15% to the publisher, 35% to the composer. There's an item, 25% commission of 54 marks and 31 marks. No doubt that's all in order. Then the publisher produced and distributed 180 copies of the manuscript. This I noticed from the 400 marks, which, generous as I am, I pay. Copyright fees, stamp fees, these items are always welcome. Finally, I recall that I spent a whole heavy week at rehearsals, for which I had the publisher send me 300 marks. Those 300 marks are all that remained to me. The theatre took in 10,000 marks for my play, the transcription bureau took 400 marks, the publisher 150 marks, the composer 276 marks, the collection agency earned 20 marks, and even 20 marks is not to be sniffed at. Actors, stagehands, newspapers gained from it, and I must pay another 123 marks and 5 pfennigs on top. Now I sit here going over it all. Legal complaints, the ban, 123 marks, 5 pfennigs, and seriously consider whether I should prohibit any further performances. I'm not going to fall for this again. Another success, and I'll be ruined. Social justice requires, in reality, that theatre managers, publishers, collection agencies, all economically more powerful than the author, should go and write their own plays.
Oh no. Gosh, yes, it's difficult to make money from writing.
Well, difficult to make money from translation as well.
Yes. Still, yeah, still the case. Okie dokie. Oh dear. All right. So, is there anything that you want to say about that before I launch into some more, like, talking
Well,
about the end of
I'm going
season?
to say a few things about this series and about our endeavours to bring Döblin to a wider audience.
Yes,
Because
let's do that then.
this is the final episode of
Of
our season
season 1. Yep.
one, which brings us up to the to the exile years and later, which will
Hooray! So I can't believe we've done 10 full episodes. That's very exciting.
10 full episodes with quite a lot of information, which has never before really become available in English.
Absolutely. Yeah, and here
So
all in one place as well, which is
all in one
brilliant.
place. And so, I would think, often people say, oh, for a book or a play or something, you don't need to know anything about the writer. You just
Mhm.
enjoy the product.
The experience.
On
And
the
it's
other hand, there are enormous numbers of biographies of writers and and other artistic figures, and people
mhm.
buy these biographies and enjoy them and learn from them,
Yep.
and it enriches their experience of this creator's works.
So I was looking last night at our listenership around the world from our various analytic sources, and it looks like we have quite a lot of people listening from Canada, which is fantastic. A few from Australia, a few in America, and interestingly, not many people within the UK, but more global. So that's great.
Well, that's the internet for you, isn't it?
That's it. Yeah, it's exciting.
The world is
So
our
hello everyone. So I think we discussed that maybe we would look at some positive responses.
Yeah, but let's put this in context,
Mhm,
right? I mean, I've spent now. Well, I began 30 years ago, but then there was a 20-year hiatus,
mhm,
right? So let's say for the past 10 or 12 years, my retirement hobby, shall we say, has really been to bring Döblin, to make him more available to readers of English.
mm,
So I first of all, set out to translate all those epic novels that had not previously appeared in English, which were six and a third of them. So I finished that job a couple of years ago. 5 years ago, I set up the website beyondalexanderplatz.com to highlight the translations as they went along, and also highlight some other figures from, roughly the Weimar years of writers who'd been unjustly neglected. And that website has jogged along, and it's received a few reader responses and so on, which are generally so glad that at last they can read something of Döblin, which is not Berlin Alexanderplatz, because having read Alexanderplatz, they were really looking for more of his works and could never find them in English. So, lots of very complimentary comments for these efforts. And then you came along with this brilliant idea of starting the podcast.
Hurrah.
And perhaps I should say we have had one particular reaction to the podcast from
Go on.
a mutual friend, shall we say. He should remain anonymous, but, let's just call him Tim. Chris has tried to turn me on to that damn German writer for 40 years. But it took Katie's freshness and enthusiasm to actually make me take an interest, finally.
Oh, yay. Thank you so much, Tim. It's very appreciated.
For suggesting this project, because this, if you like, the translations were phase one, get the groundwork done. The website was phase two, to, put up a platform there where, people could find out more if they wanted to know more. Phase, and the website led to the publication in English of so far 3, and in September this year there'll be 4 book publications of more of his epic novels. But now we're really in phase 3, which is this podcast series, and what I hope will be a series of adventurous reader guides to the epic worlds of Alfred Döblin. And my publisher, I've signed a contract now with my publisher, who's going to be bringing out the missing first volume of November 1918.
Fantastic.
And Soldiers. And he's also going to be bringing out the Adventurous Reader's Guide to the Epic Worlds of Alfred Döblin, which contains 6 dozen excerpts from the 7 titles that I've translated.
And Chris, both of those are going to be out and available to buy in October 2024.
September, October, yeah.
Fantastic. That's very exciting.
Yes. So, we would hope that this phase 3 is then going to, it's the Rolling Stone, which is at last picking up some moss and growing as it rolls along. And so, news will spread.
Let's hope so. And so can we give our listeners a flavour of what might be coming in season 2? So season 2 will be another 10 episodes.
Yes. Well, the initial scoping of it. Well, first of all, Döblin could never turn off the tap of his creativity. And so he'd already embarked on the Babylonian exile even before he went into exile. He carried a briefcase with the first few chapters of it with him across the Swiss border.
Oh, fab.
February 1933. So there was that one. He dashed off a kind of realistic kind of family novel, which was translated in English as Men Without Mercy, which was, it was based heavily on his own family, but fictionalized. He then produced his big South American trilogy, which was published as The Land Without Death a couple of years ago. And he began to look back on the end of the First World War and the horrors that happened, with the breakdown in Germany and so on. So in November 1918, which occupied him for a good 5 years, and it expanded beyond all bounds. The current printed edition is in 4 volumes, totaling about 2,200 pages.
Wow.
Yeah, but the English translation that came out in the 1980s completely missed out the first volume, as well as several passages from what they did actually print.
Right.
And then there's the harrowing tale of his escape from France in 1940. His time in Hollywood, including his year in Hollywood, where my little take on this is that he narrowly missed an Oscar. I'm not sure quite how narrowly or widely he missed it, but I think
I remember us mentioning that. I think that was probably in episode 1 or 2, didn't we?
His year in Hollywood in one episode. I think we need to deal with, with his time in Los Angeles, the kind of the milieu of German exiles, many of whom were doing pretty well out there, whereas he was, I don't know. I mean, sometimes he wasn't very well. He was feeling he was trying to interest publishers into doing translations of his books and was really getting nowhere. He did publish an introduction to the sayings of Confucius, which actually did very well and was still being reprinted even into the mid-1950s.
Let's not give too much away, Chris. We want to save it for next season.
Yeah. But then we have the after the Second World War ended, he went back to France, and there's his time working for the French Occupation Authority in southwest Germany.
Yes.
Again, trying to launch. Well, he did in fact launch a literary journal. Tried talking to publishers to get some of his other works published in Germany, but it was dribs and drabs and discord. Like Volume 1 came out this year, Volume 2 will come out next year in a different color cover. Nobody knows that they're linked. It's a messy, very messy publication trail. So we'll be doing I would imagine, a whole episode on the publication history of Döblin's works.
Okay.
And and then his kind of posthumous rediscovery, shall we say, and the way in which his family engaged with editors to bring out editions of his works, and how that really only stabilized, I think, in the past 10, 15 years, with the current collected works. They did 24 volumes of collected works. But they're copyright will end in a few years on all of the works, so I don't know what kind of publishers will feel that they should be bringing out, which they wouldn't have brought out if they had to pay royalties, and we'll have to wait and see.
Okay.
There's a lot to talk about. It was a very eventful period, those 12 years of exile. Right.
Okie dokie. Well, that's exciting. I feel we should probably wrap this up. This has probably been one of our longer ones. Let's say goodbye then. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. That's bye-bye from me.
Okay, bye-bye from me. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Epic Worlds of Alfred Döblin. Join us next time to explore more about this fascinating writer's life and works. Meanwhile, visit the website beyond-alexanderplatz.com for posts about Döblin and some of his unjustly neglected contemporaries, as well as downloads of translations. So until next time, happy reading!